would like to welcome you back to our journey through the Passion Week. We are now come to Saturday of Passion Week, which was a Sabbath day in Jesus' time. If you would have asked me a week ago what happened on the Saturday of Passion Week, I probably would have told you nothing. But that would have been incorrect. In reading this week, I have come across a little section of scripture that I had forgotten about. And that is recorded in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 62. And we'll be reading from Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 62. Just to remind you of what has just gone before. The previous day, Jesus has died on the cross and he has been buried. And in verse 62 it says, the next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priest and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. That deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and they made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. Jesus has died and he is in the tomb, but the Pharisees and the chief priests are still working and they're still concerned. It seems striking that they are afraid. They tell Pilate that they're afraid that the disciples will steal the body and that they will tell people that Jesus is raised from the dead, and they're afraid that, in their words, that the people will be deceived. I have a suspicion, I can't prove it, but I have a suspicion that they really were afraid that he just might really be raised from the dead. Had they not seen his miracles and heard of miracles that he had done? In fact, even when confronted by his miracles, on several occasions, they did not deny that the miracles had been done. They merely accused him of doing them by the power of Satan. So they knew he had power to perform miracles. Not have heard of the events surrounding his crucifixion on the previous day, when the earth shook, when the curtain in the temple was torn. Could something be tugging in the back of their mind, making them wonder, maybe he really will be raised from the dead? I don't know if that's what they really feared, or if what they really feared is what they told Pilate, that the disciples would steal the body and deceive the people. But regardless, their fear was very real. And it was so real that they broke the Sabbath. You see, when we read in verse 62, the next day, the one after preparation day is Friday, the next day is the Sabbath. They are going on the Sabbath day, and not just any Sabbath day, because you see, if a Sabbath day happens while a feast is going on, then it becomes a high Sabbath or a special Sabbath. And it's even more important to observe. And these are the same scribes and Pharisees that had been chastising Jesus on numerous occasions for little small infractions that they view in their infractions that they viewed of the Sabbath. Things like when Jesus would walk through the fields and ate the grain on the Sabbath day, or Jesus healed a person on the Sabbath day. And they had condemned Jesus sharply for violating their traditions concerning the Sabbath. But now they themselves will violate the Sabbath by making the journey to go see Pilate. And also, they are going into the home, to the governor's mansion. They're going into the home of a Gentile, which would pronounce them as unclean for keeping the Sabbath. This is probably the first time in their whole lives that these men had ever broken the Sabbath. There must have been some real fear that was motivating them. If you were a Jew living in the first century, and you had heard about Jesus and you didn't know what to think, and you said, well, I heard there's some gospel accounts going around. There's this one by a guy that used to be a tax collector named Matthew. Perhaps I'll read it. And you started to read this section where it says in verse 62, the next day, the one after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to see Pilate. If you were a Jew reading that, you would have responded like, what? They did what? It would have been unthinkable. And you remember, we've mentioned before that Matthew, more than any of the other gospel writers, is very critical of the religious leaders and the religious establishment. And he constantly points out their hypocrisy. Why might he be doing this? Is Matthew on a vendetta against the Jewish leaders because they killed Jesus? Does he hate them? No. Matthew realizes that people are going to be reading his gospel and trying to decide whether they believe in Jesus. And during that time, there are people that are reading Matthew's gospel to decide whether they believe in Jesus are also going to be hearing what the chief priests and the Pharisees say about Jesus. And so Matthew is trying to paint a picture of both of them and say, who would you trust? Would you trust Jesus, who stands before Pilate, and even though it's going to mean his death, claims to be the Messiah? Or would you trust the chief priests and the Pharisees, who would violate the Sabbath in order to try to prevent Jesus' resurrection? Pilate hears the request, and he tells them, take a guard, go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. I don't know what was in Pilate's mind, but when I read that, there seems to be a tinge of uncertainty in Pilate's mind. Sure, go, take the guard, make a seal, do the best you can to keep him in. Perhaps there was a tinge of speculation in the back of Pilate's mind as well, that Jesus would be raised from the dead. Yes, they're allowed to go and make it as secure as they can, but it doesn't matter how many soldiers or guards or armies go to guard that tomb. Jesus is going to come out of it, and there's nothing that they can do about it. we want to turn now to Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. We're actually going to learn a little bit about some ladies who did something, or at least on the Sabbath, or at least it tells us that they did nothing. Well, we have to read it for you to understand. But when we back up to Luke chapter 23, and we start in verse 50, this is backing us up to the events of yesterday, of Friday, right after Jesus died on the cross, and he was then going to be buried. We had Joseph of Arimathea coming to bury him, and they had to rush because the Jewish Sabbath day started at 6 p.m., so they had to rush and get him in. But it tells us that there were women that were there with them as Joseph was doing these preparations. And let's pick up in verse 55 and see what it says about these women. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the command. You see, the women were part of the late Friday afternoon rush to help to observe where the body was laid. And then they went home and they wanted to bring back spices, but now it has already become the Sabbath. And of course the Sabbath is, for the Jews, a day of rest. These women very much wanted to immediately go back and to take the spices and the perfumes and anoint Jesus' body in the tomb on the Sabbath day. But they recognized God's law. They recognized, as it said in the end, they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the command. They understood that God had given a command that they rest on the Sabbath, and as much as they wanted to go and anoint Jesus, they obeyed God's law and they rested. So these ladies, who probably in estimation of the people of that day would have been just ordinary women, they proved faithful to God's command, as opposed to the chief priests and the Pharisees who break God's command and don't observe the Sabbath. It was to be a day of rest. Now we come to the last question. We have seen that that on the Sabbath, that the chief priests and the Pharisees break the Sabbath to get a guard at Jesus' tomb. The women obey the Sabbath and rest. And our last question is, what was Jesus doing? Some have claimed that Jesus, between his death and his resurrection, that he went to hell. This has been a statement that's made by preachers. Is also, if you look in church history, there's people in the course of church history who have taught and believed that Jesus went to hell between his death and his resurrection. Perhaps one of the reasons is that the Bible does say that Jesus went to Hades. And there's been some confusion by some who confuse Hades with hell. Hades in the Bible just refers to what we call the realm of the dead. In Acts chapter 2, Peter will talk about Jesus when he died going to Hades, or in some translations, it will actually say realm of the dead. Hades is different from hell. Hell is the place of torment after the final judgment. In the book of Revelation, when it talks about the final judgment, it says that death and Hades will give up the dead, and then they will be judged. So the people that died, for instance, in the Old Testament, they all went to Hades, to the realm of the dead. You perhaps remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus. In the story of rich man and Lazarus, we find them in Hades, in the realm of the dead. But the rich man was in torment, and Lazarus was in, it says, the bosom of Abraham. He was in a place of rest and comfort, while the rich man was in a place of torment. They were both in Hades, in the realm of the dead, but the Bible says there was a gulf that separated them, that separated those that were being tormented and those that were being comforted. So it's interesting that Jesus is on the cross, and you remember there's two thieves, and we know from one gospel they were both speaking harshly against Jesus. In another gospel, we learn that one of them later repented and asked for forgiveness and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And Jesus, in reply, said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." It didn't sound like Jesus planned on being in hell later that day, but rather being in Hades, in the part that we call Abraham's bosom, or paradise. Some people say, though, but Jesus had to go to hell to fight Satan. Sometimes they believe that there had to be this showdown between Jesus and Satan, and Jesus had to walk into hell and to tear hell apart, and there had to be this fight between Jesus and the devil in hell. But yesterday, when Jesus cried out and gave up the spirit, John says, he said, "It is finished," which we said is the cry of a cry of triumph, is as he is saying, "I won. I achieved what I was supposed to do. I accomplished what God sent me to do. I was victorious." The victory was won at the cross. There's no indication in Scripture that Jesus had to go and fight a further battle. Others claim that Jesus had to go to hell in order to be punished. You know, he was suffering for our punishment, and so he needed to taste our punishment for us, so he had to go to hell. I know of no scripture that indicates that he had to be punished further. The suffering that I read that he suffered was the suffering that he suffered on the cross. I may have missed something in some of the text, and maybe if you come across something or you know of some place where it mentions otherwise, please let us know and shoot us a comment where we can look it up. But as far as I know, all of his suffering took place in his death, not in a later journey to hell. So that brings up the question, what was Jesus doing? If he was in the realm of the dead, what was he doing there? I would like to propose an answer for your consideration. I would like to propose that he was resting. That he was resting and keeping the Sabbath. You remember God in the beginning in Genesis created, and he created for 7 days. And we might note here, while he was creating, John tells us that in the beginning when God was creating, Jesus was right there with him. So God and Jesus right there with him were creating for 6 days. And on the Sabbath day, God rested. God looked over his creation that he had created, and he said it was good, and then he created man, and then he said it was very good, and then he says, now I can rest. Because what? It's completed. Jesus, all through this week, is coming through this journey and coming through to the battle, which was on Friday. And on Friday he yells those words or screams those words, "It is finished! I've won! I've completed it! I've done it! I've overcome! I've been victorious!" And they took down his body and they prepared it and they rushed and it was only a matter of minutes or maybe an hour, a very short period of time between his death and him being put in the grave and it turning 6 o'clock on Friday evening when the Sabbath started, till he started keeping Sabbath. And right after Sabbath was over, he got up out of the tomb. You see, on Saturday, after he had died, he was resting in his tomb, and his spirit was in Hades, or the realm of the dead. It was in fellowship with God. Jesus was at rest. He wasn't in turmoil. The Father wasn't in turmoil. Yes, maybe the apostles and the disciples, is he going to... They had thought everything had come to an end. He's dead and probably no hope. Could he really be raised? I don't think that's really possible. Yes, that they were struggling. And the religious leaders perhaps weren't keeping Sabbath. But the Father was resting. Jesus was resting. Heaven was at rest because they knew the business had been done. We return to a notion that we mentioned yesterday by some. The notion that they view the cross, the Friday, as really being Satan's day. You know, that's Satan's day. He got Jesus and he killed him. So that was his day. And Satan was victorious on Friday. But you know what? Come Sunday, God reversed all that and flipped it all around. I suggest to you that that is a false view. Jesus declared victory on Friday. And on Saturday, on the Sabbath, heaven was at rest because it knew everything was secure. There's a little phrase that Peter uses in Acts chapter 2, and I believe it's verse 24, where he said God raised him from the dead because it was impossible for death to keep him. It was impossible. The idea here is, it's not like Jesus dies on the cross and then he's going to go down into the depths of hell and he's going to do this great battle this great battle with the devil, and then we'll have to see if he's able to come out on Sunday. No. What he did on the cross secured his victory. And because of who he was and what he did on the cross, there was no doubt in God's mind, in Jesus' mind, in heaven's mind. He was coming up out of that grave. But he had a day of rest. What I wanted to suggest to you today, how this might have an impact on you, I want to suggest that today be a day of rest for you. I don't mean that you can't do anything, you can't do any housework, or you can't do anything else. But that it be a day that your soul's at rest. Because you know that the battle has been won. Yep. See, Jesus had died on the cross, and heaven knew that the battle had been won, and heaven and Jesus knew that he was going to be raised on Sunday, but they hadn't seen it yet. And some of us are living in a reality where we've heard what Jesus has done, and we've heard of what it's going to mean for us in the future, but we haven't seen that yet. We're still waiting for all the blessings that come from our salvation to be realized. I want to encourage you to be still, to be at rest, to be at peace, and to know that Jesus has truly won. Tomorrow will be the day of resurrection. We encourage you to make plans this evening with your family, agree upon the time when you will meet, and you may worship together and read scriptures together and sing and pray and partake of the Lord's Supper together. And we hope and pray that you'll do that. There's also services that we post links to online that you can join in with those and watch those and participate with them. And we hope you'll take advantage of that as well. And we'd like for you to reflect as you meet with your family. Have some time of reflection and try to get your family to interact with you and ask questions about what does it mean for us that Jesus is raised from the dead? How does this make a difference in our lives? And I pray that you will have a rich and a rich time with your family as you discuss those things and involve everyone in your family in that discussion. I will be back with you for a final time in our journey through the Passion Week tomorrow at the same time at 6:30, and hope to see you there. God bless you. Good night.